discussion, connecting truth to our hardest questions and deepest beliefs. The students and campus ministers who have planned this forum are inspired by the idea that Jesus Christ has something relevant to offer our university in its search for knowledge and truth and significance. With that inspiration, we welcome those who bring other backgrounds, perspectives, and commitments to the table, and we honor all questions just as we bring our own. We have asked our presenter to share personally, and we hope that in tonight's Q&A we can ask questions of each other, honestly, model a conversation that all of us can continue this evening and onward. Our hope is that everyone in this room would be challenged. For those who would call themselves Christian, we hope you will be challenged by our presenter to examine your faith with intellectual honesty and rigor. For those who think of the Christian faith as mystifying, irrelevant, or disproved, we hope you will be challenged by hearing from a Christian intellectual who can make a serious case for why their faith in Jesus makes sense to them. The Veritas Forum is sponsored by Live Club, the Hamilton Navigators, Power to Change, and McMaster Divinity College. The Veritas planning team aims to create events that are relevant, thought-provoking, and engaging to people of all backgrounds and beliefs, and we need your help with that. So, please pick up your Veritas 60-second survey card and pencil we provided, and take 15 seconds just now to fill out the front information with your name and other small personal information. Your email address is only to send you an online link for feedback where you can share your thoughts on tonight's forum. We really want your feedback, so please do sign up for that. We will not email you about anything else unless you check one of the boxes at the bottom of the card, or unless you win the raffle for the new iPad we're emailing to let you know. So that's one email you will not want to miss. Okay. After tonight's event, please fill out the remaining sections of your survey card. Be sure to fill out the front and back sides. At the end of the forum, please bring your card with you as you exit and leave it on one of the boxes provided by the ushers. Please also note that your questions can be texted to the number up above on the blackboard at any time during this event. 30 minutes will be devoted to answering your questions at the end of tonight's event. Now, I'd like to introduce Dr. David Haskell, Professor of Religious Studies of Wilfrid Laurier University, our speaker for tonight on the topic of truth in media. Before he comes up here though, a little background knowledge. A large portion of Dr. Haskell's research has focused on the media's perception and portrayal of Christians. His peer-reviewed studies on that topic have appeared in top academic publications including the Journal of Media and Religion, the Journal of Communication and Religion, and the Journal of Religion and Popular Culture. His book, Through a Lens Darkly, is the only academic text to focus exclusively on the Canadian media's relationship with religion. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Haskell to the podium.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here tonight. I appreciate that you're here, even though there's a threatening weather system coming in. So let's, I'll try to keep it. Oh, sorry, I saw some eyes light up. It's like, there is? I just have to head to the washroom. Excuse me for a moment. She never comes back. I want to thank the Veritas Forum for having me here tonight. It is lovely to be able to talk to people who might be interested in things that I have to say. See, as academics, we do these studies and then we don't get a chance to talk about what they are or what we found or even what they mean to us personally. So when we do get the opportunity, it's very exciting. So as you know already, I'm at Wilfrid Laurier University. I'm actually cross-appointed. I'm cross-appointed to both digital media and journalism and religion and culture. I'm one of those odd professors who teaches in two areas. And the reason that I teach in the area of journalism, I actually come by it honestly. Before I became an academic, I was a television reporter. And I was also also a features writer for newspapers. So I did that through the 1990s. And it was actually my experience as a reporter that made me interested in the topics that I researched as an academic. And what I'd like to do is just tell you a brief story that shows you how I did become interested in the topic of religion and media. Now, as a reporter, I was working at regional stations. And regional stations, unlike the national news, they often have to cover items that you might deem not very interesting. For instance, on slow news days, there were times when I had to cover a chili cook-off. Or sometimes I had to cover, I remember one time I got to go to a cat beauty contest. So there were things that you sometimes covered because it was a regional news station and it was a slow news day, and you did your best and you tried to make it interesting. Well, on one occasion, it was a slow news day, and I was told by the assignment editor, Dave, today you are going to cover a prayer garden. Well, I didn't know what a prayer garden was, but I was determined to get all of the controversial details. And here's what I did. I got into my truck, I had my camera, I went to the local Catholic elementary school, and they were opening their prayer garden. What we see on the screen it's not the actual prayer garden I went to, but it was very similar to this. There was a press conference. There was a garden in the back of the school. I talked to the principal first. I said, what is it about this prayer garden? And she said to me, our idea is that when one of the students, has a conflict with another student, instead of sending them to the principal's office, we're going to send them to the prayer garden. And I said, that might work if you send them one at a time, but not together with the person they were just fighting with. And she said, yes, that's roughly what we would do. And so that was the idea. It was like a form of retributive, or a form of justice that was more along the Aboriginal Canadian model. It was restorative justice, of a sense. Well, I got that interview, and then I went and I'm watching, and a priest comes up, because it was a Catholic school, and the priest delivers a prayer, which was appropriate. It was a prayer garden, and then a homily, which is a sermon. And I got all that, and I headed back to the station. I said, okay, I'm going to write this up. It was going to be maybe a minute-long story. It didn't take me long. I edited the piece, I wrote the narrative, and as we say, I had it in the can, and I was ready to go and eat my dinner. Well, just before I left, I had my news director say, Dave, before you leave, I want to talk to you about your piece. And I said, okay. He said, I need you to change it. Now, I was interested in this because typically one is not asked to change one's piece unless you've committed libel. You've done something that's going to get the station in trouble. And I said, well, what's the problem? And he said to me, at the very start of your video, you have the priest praying, and he keeps talking about Jesus and the Spirit of Jesus and the power of Jesus. You've got to edit that out before we can air the report. Now, I was confused because this was a story about a prayer garden, and I was showing someone praying in that garden. So it fit. And the bulk of the press conference had focused on the priest and his talk. So again, I was accurately relaying the main theme of the event. Someone who'd been to the event would have said, yeah, that's what happened. And I explained these points and my confusion to my news director, and this is what he told me. Our news broadcast has a multicultural audience, and having all those references to Jesus in the report are going to make people uncomfortable. To respect their feelings, we need to take that out. Now, I'd like to tell you that I said something wrong. I'd like to tell you that I said something clever, that somehow I took a stand of some sort, for some reason, but I didn't. I was a young reporter, and I just accepted the advice of my boss, and I made the change. I edited it out. And I probably would have forgotten about that incident, unless it didn't happen in some other form again and again while I was a reporter in these regional news stations. I'll just give you one more example. In the last leg of my career as a reporter, I was working in Kitchener, and I had to go and cover a farmer, a Mennonite farmer, who was giving away hay to other farmers in Alberta. It just so happened that that year there was a terrible drought in Alberta. They didn't have enough hay to feed their livestock. Livestock were going hungry, and this fella, the Mennonite, said, "I got more than enough." I went out, I interviewed him, I brought the interview tape back, and I edited it. Again, I thought I'd done an okay job for a slow news day and a slow news story. But again, I was asked by my news director to come into his office. "Haskell," he says, "you've got to change your story." I said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "Did you see the clip that you put in of that Mennonite when you asked him, 'Why are you doing what you're doing?'" I said, "Yeah." He told me why he's doing what he's doing. He said, "Listen to it. Play it for me." In the clip, the Mennonite farmer said, "I'm doing this because Jesus says I've got to do unto others as I want them to do unto me. I've got to do it for the very least of my brethren. That's why I'm doing this." And I said, "That's what he said. Those are the facts of the story. That's his motivation." And the news director said, "And it's got to be changed. People are going to be offended by that." He said, "I want you to write it in as a piece of narrative. I want you to write it in and say that he gave the hay for religious reasons, or because his faith motivated it." And to be honest, I can't remember if he even let me say what his faith was. He could have been Buddhist. He could have been Hindu. I can't remember if I was allowed to say. But it was situations like that, as a reporter, that made me think, maybe this happens more often. Maybe this happens not just to me. So even though anecdotal evidence cannot constitute research, and it doesn't, anecdotal evidence can push you into research. Those observations can make you want to look to see if something is actually going on. What I noticed in my anecdotal evidence was that when Christians were engaged in what society at large would deem positive behavior, the religious motivation behind their actions was either ignored or made exceedingly vague in news reports. I also observed that when an issue or event related to Christians presented several potential storylines, it was always the most controversial storyline that would be chosen and followed. I also found that when the topic of devout Christians came up in the newsroom, inevitably one of my colleagues would voice discomfort or disdain for those kind of people. Then about 15 years ago, I took those observations and I became an academic. I went back to school, I got my PhD, and what I decided to do as my major research project for my doctorate was to see how Christians were portrayed in the Canadian news media. I empirically studied how conservative Protestant Christians were portrayed, and this is what the cover of my book looked like. So I took my research and I published several peer-reviewed studies, but I added to it to put it into a book, Through a Lens Darkly, How the News Media Perceive and Portray Evangelical Christians. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, the term evangelical is another word for conservative Protestant. And the reason that I looked at conservative Protestant Christians in particular was really the timing. I was looking at a time period of 11 years from the the late 90s to the early mid-2000s. And during that time, if I looked at Catholics, all the news reports, and most of the news reports, would have been about the sex scandal, the priest sex scandal, and I wanted the diversity of coverage. If I looked at mainline Protestants, and in Canada, mainline Protestants are the Anglican, the Presbyterian, the much coverage is that they tend not to be at odds with the value systems of many media people. They're left alone or ignored. So I decided to look at those conservative Protestants, people who we would call traditional believers more than anything. Conservative Protestants or evangelicals tend to take the Bible more literally, especially the New Testament, by the way. Some of you in the audience may be conservative Protestant yourself. And these people, of which I guess I'm in that camp, these people, they take the Bible more literally, and as a result, they also have social values that are more conservative than most Canadians. And it's that tension that gets them more news coverage. You see, one of the principles of news is you go for the things that are unusual. And conservative Protestants, in the eyes of many Canadians, are unusual. What I want to do now for the next maybe 10 minutes is show you what I found. These were the key questions that I was looking at. I wanted to know, how do national TV journalists feel about conservative Christians? I wanted to know, how do national TV journalists report on conservative Christians? And can one show statistically that how national TV journalists feel about evangelicals or conservative Protestants affects how they report on these conservative Christians? But here's why my study, why this question has any validity at all. Journalists in the West at one time agreed with near uniformity that journalistic objectivity, also known as accuracy, impartiality, and fairness, should guide the writing of news reports. In fact, the Code of Ethics of the Canadian Journalism Association still supports this idea. So we should expect that journalists will provide unbiased coverage even to those with whom they disagree. And if this is not an expectation, then my study wouldn't be valid at all. So if I'm looking at how conservative Christians are portrayed, I have to believe that they should be portrayed fairly, impartially. That was the crux of my understanding. First, I wanted to see, how do Canadian national journalists feel about conservative Christians? So I surveyed the journalists at CTV, Global, and CBC. 66% of the surveyed respondents said they had no religious faith, and 14% did not actively practice the faith they claimed to hold. Now this, in contrast to 17% of all other Canadians at the time, in terms of not having religious faith. That number is greater now, but at the time of the survey, it was only 17%. So these people were radically more irreligious. That's not a bad thing. That's not something I'm condemning them for. I'm just saying we need to know where they stood on this issue. Also, 85.5% of journalists claim no or little common ground with conservative Christians in terms of their religious belief. So now we're seeing, not only do they not have religious belief, they admit to not having common ground with those who do. Which is still not a problem if it doesn't affect their coverage. I wanted to dig a little bit deeper, so I asked these national level journalists, on what social issues do you find yourself most at odds with conservative Christians? These were the top responses that were given. 71% said they felt that conservative Christians were wrong to oppose homosexual rights and gay marriage, and that was the most unified response on the survey. 57% felt that conservative Christians were wrong to oppose abortion. Again, they have every right to hold these views. What we want to see is, does it affect their coverage? What I needed to do then, as part of this study, was, now that I knew where the national level journalists stood, I had to look at the coverage itself. And I analyzed 11 years of national television news reports from CTV, Global, and CBC. If a report featured a conservative Christian who was not a Catholic, it was included in the sample and analyzed. Now, how do you do something like that, you may be asking? Well, first of all, to find someone who's a conservative Christian, if they said they were a conservative Christian, that got included in the study. If it said that they attended a certain church, Pentecostal, Baptist, Christian Missionary Alliance, Salvation Army, and I had a list of all the conservative Christian denominations in Canada, then they got included in the study. If the word evangelical was used to describe a person, they were included in the study, and so on and so on and so on. So that's how that part was determined. But what you might be asking is, well, how else did you code these reports? First of all, I didn't code them. I enlisted the help of coders, 2 graduate students. And the reason I did that was so that no one could accuse me of trying to find something when it wasn't there. And what I said to them was, you need to find evidence. You need to find evidence that shows me when there's manipulation of the data. Because it was many other studies that have looked for bias in media have made the claim that just because someone is covered negatively, that there was bias. And I don't agree. I think that there are Christians who do really stupid things. I think that there are Christians who, when they steal or have sex with somebody who's one of their parishioners, that's pretty bad. And reporting on that is not bias. That's fact. So what I had my coders do, they had to list if there was evidence of omission, if there was evidence of exaggeration, if there was evidence of manipulation of fact, and only then would we say this report has been biased. But it wasn't biased if the report reported on someone who was a Christian doing something bad. That wasn't biased. So just so we're clear on that. The first thing that the coders found was, what was the topic of the news report? You may be surprised by this. 30% of the report showed conservative Christians involved in political action. Now, the reason you might be surprised at this is conservative Christians do not belong to political parties any more than average Canadians. Yet if you were a Martian and you came down to Canada and you said, what are Christians like? You'd think they were highly political people, according to the number of news reports about them. 17% showed them in criminal or immoral situations. Many of those were deserved, by the way. Sorry, but we have a lot of televangelists out there who just are nasty people, in my opinion. And we've got 14% showed engagement in social protest. What was really surprising to me was that only 2.5% of reports over an 11-year period showed conservative Christians involved in charity or volunteer work. Why is that surprising? Because as a sociologist, I know that conservative Christians volunteer 3 times more than average Canadians. I know that conservative Christians give an average of over $1,000 a year to charity versus $235 by other Canadians. I know that the largest non-governmental organization responsible for charity and social benefit in Canada are conservative Christian organizations. So I was baffled to see how low that number was. So even in that, there was something showing me that there was a conflict between the values of the people creating the news and those they were reporting on. But then we had to look at, was there evidence of manipulation? I like this picture. I don't know if you can see it. I really want you to focus on this because it took me a long time in Photoshop to make this happen. Okay, look at the guy. He's my stereotypical Christian. You see, he's got his Bible there. It's got a fish on it. That's how you know he's a Christian. He's got a Bible with a fish on it. And then look in the camera. He's open-handed there, talking to media, but over there, ooh, in the camera lens, in the spot where you can see, oh, he's pounding his Bible. There, I'm trying to make it. That's a visual point. I thought that was clever. I thought that was really clever. Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So here's what we know about the manipulation of the actual reports. Just over half of the reports showed evidence of negative bias. And it was focused primarily on a few key unflattering stereotypes. For instance, in 25% of reports, facts were excluded or distorted in order to depict conservative Christians as intolerant. In 13%, facts were omitted or misrepresented to depict conservative Christians as criminally minded. And in 8% of reports, specific language was used or facts were slanted to portray conservative Christians as un-Canadian. And keep in mind, this is where there was evidence for deliberate tampering. Now, it's one thing to be told some empirical numbers, or you hear the numbers, but it's another thing to be given a story. While the numbers provide empirical proof to clearly illustrate how a journalist can slant a story against conservative Christians, you got to provide an example. Now, here's an example, and I call it the CBC National News versus conservative Christian Sarah Palin. Do you remember her? She was the vice presidential candidate with John McCain. There she is with John McCain. You don't have to like her to like this story, by the way. So this story involves a report filed by Neil MacDonald, a senior TV reporter for CBC's flagship news program, The National. The story aired on September 2008. It was a background piece on Sarah Palin. Remember, she was a conservative politician. She'd just been named the Republican Party's vice presidential candidate. The reporter, MacDonald, reported, or he was supposed to in his report, reveal to the Canadian public who Palin was and what she was all about. It was a background piece. But what it seemed to reveal were MacDonald's own biases. At one point in the story, MacDonald ran a snippet from a speech that Palin had delivered to local church leaders earlier that year. And it showed her telling those in the pews that she believed America's war against Iraq was endorsed by God. The interview clip was meant to convince viewers that as a staunch conservative Christian, Palin was a dangerous warmonger, and that she thought the war in Iraq was a holy war, and it called up images of the Crusades. But the problem was, MacDonald had edited off the beginning of the clip, and in doing so had changed the meaning completely. A posting on YouTube where Palin's complete speech can be viewed lets one compare MacDonald's version to the real, full version. The portion of the interview that MacDonald included in his report began with Palin saying of the Iraq War, "Our leaders, our national leaders, are sending them out on a task that is from God." However, what Palin had actually said was this: "Pray for our military men and women who are striving to do what is right. Also, for this country, pray that our leaders, our national leaders, are sending them out on a task that is from God." Someone watching or reading the full quote in its true context could see that Palin was not raising a war cry, she was raising a question. Is this war a task from God? It's a question to which she does not have an answer, and she advises praying for divine guidance in the hope of finding the right path. Now listen, I am no fan of Sarah Palin. In fact, I can tell you about things she has done, real, verifiable indiscretions that she's committed, that would lead me to think that she is not a great person. However, that doesn't give license to a journalist to manipulate information, to create negative coverage, to advance his own ideological position. You can't do that. So let's move to finish this section with some conclusions. Simple observation suggests there's a connection between journalists' feelings about conservative Christians and their coverage of conservative Christians. But statistical analysis in my research also showed there is a connection as well. So you've got to move beyond just saying, here's what we found, you run the numbers to see if there's something statistically significant. And what I found was reports in which the words and deeds of conservative Christians clashed most directly with the heartfelt convictions of the journalists, for instance, those stories about homosexual rights, were significantly more likely to evidence manifest signs of negative manipulation, and the results had high statistical significance. Keep in mind, this study was published in the Journal of Religion, or Communication and Religion, and the only reason I tell you that is you want to know that the numbers actually worked out, that the numbers were what they said they were. What we are interested in, what social scientists are interested in, is the ability to predict. What I was able to show was that if you can find out what journalists believe strongly, when there are those who go against those beliefs, and those events or issues are most strongly against their beliefs, you'll also find the greatest amount of manipulation. That's problematic when you realize that journalists and journalism in the West is founded on an idea of objectivity in journalism. Abandoning objectivity. Here's the major conclusion. News professionals tend to see conservative Christians' religious belief and social values, especially in terms of sexuality, homosexuality, and abortion, as wrong. It is a conviction that their own more liberal beliefs and values are correct and best for society that causes journalists to slant their coverage against conservative Christians with whom they disagree. But if that's all I told you tonight, it would actually be fairly boring. Because what we want to know is, well, why is this? Is there a consequence? Is there a larger theory at play? And how does it affect the overall standing of truth and media? That's what you want to know. You want to know, how do I apply this? Well, first of all, let's talk about this idea of the consequence of abandoning objectivity. As any young child will tell you, there's a consequence to breaking your promise. And in the West, we've taken it for granted that journalists will keep their promise. And the promise was that they would be impartial when they cover a particular story. In fact, the whole reason that we believe in freedom of the press, we say that you don't have to be regulated, is because you're going to regulate yourself. That's the assumption. That's the promise. The reason that journalists get to go places you can't is because they promise that they're going to be fair when they get there. But when you break a promise, when you lose objectivity, there are consequences. Well, people will stop believing. Here's the percentage of Canadians who trust journalists by year. It's lower now in 2016. This is based on Ipsos Reid and Leger market survey information. The 2012 data is from the Ipsos Reid, and in 2008 I got from Leger market survey, so I've combined the two. But this is outstanding, or this is frightfully shocking. There are consequences. Now you would think, I would think, given the extreme lack of trust that Canadians have for journalists now, that journalists would redouble their efforts and begin to insist, we're going to be more objective. We're going to be more impartial. You'd think they would do that. But in fact, all indications are that the move is exactly in the other direction. That increasingly, younger journalists are abandoning the idea of objectivity. And this is something I know because I teach in a journalism school. This is something I know because I meet at conferences with people who are journalism professors. And this is a dangerous precedent. It's a dangerous precedent for truth. published my book, Through a Lens Darkly, in 2009, I made a particular claim. I said that I did not believe that most journalists were intentionally slanting their coverage against their ideological opponents. Instead, I argued that it was probably unconscious or subconscious. But if I published my book today, I would not make that claim. I think many journalists today who are slanting the reports know exactly what they're doing, and it's done with clear intent. And as I've said, younger journalists are more apt to do this than the older ones. I want to conclude by discussing why the change from an unconscious mistake to a deliberate act. I attribute it to the dominance of cultural Marxism ideas. Now, before you believe me to be a conspiracy theorist, cultural Marxism is just a philosophical system that's sometimes known as critical theory, and it actually manifests itself in ways more benignly, like political correctness or social justice. And in those forms, it's benign, as I say, and even beneficial. But one of the fundamental notions of cultural Marxism and critical theory, and I don't have the time, I'm in my last 2 minutes of my presentation. I don't have the time, but I would encourage you to study this and find out about this. Because one of the foundational notions is, in my opinion, very troubling. To be specific, one of the key ideas of cultural Marxism is that some ideas are so wrong and hurtful, they should not be allowed to be spoken. And this is leaking more and more into common forms of social justice. Under this ideological system, it's taken as the duty of each right-thinking individual, to do what he or she can do to stop incorrect messages and ideas from being publicized. In short, the good person is the one who stops his opponent from having a voice. I want to show you a quote from a leading intellectual in the School of Critical Theory and Cultural Marxism. It's a quote by Herbert Marcuse. He's considered one of the fathers of the progressive left and an early light of the social justice movement. This is from his very popular essay, Repressive Tolerance, 1965. To achieve social justice in society may require apparently undemocratic means. They would include the withdrawal of toleration of speech and assembly from groups and movements not supporting a leftist agenda. In short, there should be intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left. Now, I'm not cherry-picking this as some essay that doesn't get any kind of attention. I'm choosing it because it's one of the most popular essays used in journalism schools today, especially in courses dedicated to advocacy journalism and journalism for social movements. So this isn't something that is just, I'm pulling it out from 1965. In fact, I became aware of it when one of my colleagues at Laurier was citing it and saying, why don't we do this and use this more often? It was only when I began to study the curriculum at other journalism schools that I saw this essay and others like it by critical theorists were actually used more often than standard text related to objectivity, impartiality, or balance. And I'd like you to remember in this final minute of my presentation that what you see in the universities eventually is what you see in the culture. So I'll close by showing you a very brief quote that reflects what was going on recently at the student newspaper at McGill. The Daily McGill was in a controversy. It had published a story that criticized Israel for its treatment of Palestinians. Some students at McGill wanted to write a reply. They did write a reply, and they submitted it to the newspaper. It was a reply that gave justification for the position of Israel. The newspaper refused to run it, and the editors and the reporters of that newspaper gave an explanation. Here's what they said. The Daily McGill maintains an editorial line of not publishing pieces which promote a Zionist worldview or any other ideology which we consider oppressive. That is to say, if we don't agree with you, you have no voice. And that's problematic. Because what they're saying explicitly is becoming the dominant ideology in media in the West. And if we have time in our discussion, we can talk about cases where this dominant ideology is stifling the truth. In the meantime, I'll close with this thought. At one time, the measure of a good news report was whether it got the facts straight. Now, in many cases, the measure of a good report is whether it advances a very particular agenda. Thank you. And we can have questions. You're going to say that, aren't you?
Yes, I was. You're way ahead of me. Oh. Yeah. So we'll take this next couple minutes if you guys have any questions or... okay. So regarding the statistic that said 2.5% of reports were about Christian volunteering, do you have similar data for other groups of people?
Volunteering? Other people volunteering?
I think other religious groups.
What I can say is that in terms of overrepresentation, if you said what percentage of the population, 3% of the population is Muslim in Canada, 3% of the population, and they are incredibly overrepresented in the news, but typically it's stories about jihadist activity. So most Muslims would be pleased if they weren't overrepresented that way, right? It's only deviant behavior. And again, this fits with the news model that it's when something aberrant happens that it gets news coverage. People who are being nice, that's not considered news most often. So I don't have any accurate statistics except to say that if you looked by percentage of the population, Muslim Canadians, well, Muslims, far more represented, but not so much Muslim Canadians, it's usually Muslims in other countries, right? And Jews are 1% of the population, and they are significantly overrepresented in Canadian news media, but not Canadian Jews, it's just Jews worldwide, and again, it's usually due to some conflict.
Did anybody else have any other questions?
Am I allowed to point? Or I don't want to steal your thunder.
I don't know. No, you can point.
I can point.
I don't know if this reaches as far, or do you want to, can you? Yeah?
Yeah, just
okay.
yeah. And then I'll repeat your question in the mic.
Have you researched at all like how the bias in Canadian media compares to like the bias in American or European media, for example?
So I haven't done it officially, but I think that I'm pretty informed, and I would say that the difference in the Canadian media is that definitely we have a far more left-leaning bias, whereas in the United States, they actually have some news stations, I'm thinking of Fox, that does have a right-wing bias. And in that way, they're very similar, that they will skew their coverage in order to meet their ideology. And I'm against that as well. I want fact. I don't want your ideology to skew what the news should be. So in the United States, it's more prevalent. We did have a Sun news station. It was a TV station here in Canada. It really wasn't able to make a go of it. We've got the National Post, but the National Post, in terms of its agenda, is fairly centrist, to be quite honest.
In terms of its right-wingness, it's not particularly right-wing in terms of what we would see in the United States. Yes?
In the time of 24-hour news cycle, everything is negative, right? Like everything on news is biased negative. If you were an alien coming down to the news and you think everyone was a racist or a murderer, right? So how do you compare how Christians are seeing that, or Muslims are seeing that, and what any group of people see that with the negative bias in the media itself? Like how can we get an accurate representation of what the media thinks of Christians and anything negative about Christians?
So my issue would be, I understand, as a former news person, I understand that it's going to be the aberrant stuff, the oddities that make the news. So I'm happy to live with that. I actually am. What I'm not happy with is when a story will be changed, when facts will be changed in order to advance a certain ideology. If you're going to be negative about somebody, at least be accurate about it. And I think that that's something that's not something that the media couldn't do. The media could do that. But again, increasingly they're moving away. And they're abandoning this idea that objectivity is important. Yes?
As a former news person, can you speak to the process of fact-checking in stories? I find that particularly interesting given the rise of apparent fake news and even recent talk that Facebook would be including a fake news warning filter run by several left-leaning agencies.
Well, at the regional level, there's very little fact-checking that goes on. And it's the obligation of the reporter to make sure that he or she is putting forth accurate stuff. There's a rule that we use as regional reporters: if said by two, it's probably true. But that just means that get it corroborated, right? Don't go ahead if just one person said it. We'll see if somebody else said it, which is pretty weak evidence. At the national level, it's usually the responsibility of the reporter and the producer, and then it's going to go through another executive producer, and they're going to do a little bit more fact-checking that way. The reason that if you have a professor, the professor might sometimes say you can use papers or you can use stories from the New York Times, the Washington Post, Globe and Mail, and the reason they do that is those larger outlets actually do have fact checkers. The editors actually do check the facts. But other than that, at the regional or local level, it's hit and miss. And in terms of fake news, even at the national level, if I wanted to fake news, I could do it. You could do it. You can create a story that's now backed up by a website. You can create a story and get people to lie and say that it happened. If you wanted a fake news story to be published and you had the money, you could absolutely do it. And you couldn't stop. You can't check for that. Unfortunately. Yes?
Yeah, just a general question. I mean, you see an irony because like censorship and repression used to be kind of fought by what you loosely call the left or the liberal side. So that used to be what right-wing people were known for, trying to clamp down on things.
Sure.
But now it's become the tool, like again, loosely speaking, it's now the tool of the left to try and clamp down and repress. And I don't know, what do you maybe comment on just the irony of that switcheroo?
So it's not really, and that's a great question, because I have thought a lot about this, and I said, what's going on there? And it's not a left or a right thing, it's a power thing. If you are in power, you want to do what you can to make sure you don't lose the power. And currently, in our society, the elites in media, the elites in the academy, the elites in government, not so much in the US right now, but in Canada, tend to be left-leaning. And you are going to find ways to keep your power. And just so it doesn't sound like I'm going too hard on the left, let's take a look at the Catholic Church in the 1800s was under Pius IX. And under Pius IX, he released something called the Syllabus of Errors that said, listen, if you're a Catholic, you can't read these books. If you're a Catholic, you actually couldn't read the Bible. You couldn't be part of a Bible study group. And he was trying to control. He didn't want people to go out and mess with Catholic doctrine. It's a power thing. And I'm not saying that the Catholic Church is left-leaning, because it wasn't, right? So it's not a right-wing thing or a left-wing thing. It's a power thing. The person in power wants to keep power, and the best way to do it is make sure that the other side doesn't have a voice. Yes?
So, one of the things I'm thinking, because I've thought about this a lot, I mean, I listen to CBC radio, and it infuriates me pretty well every day, but one of the problems, it seems to me, is that, for instance, CBC does not declare their bias. And there's this, because CBC has this aura of being a public, objective institution, that what they're saying is the truth. And this to me is the biggest problem, is that they're obviously biased, but they're presenting as if they're objective. Can you comment on that?
First of all, you're completely accurate. If I'd only looked at the CBC in my own study, the prevalence of negativity against conservative Christians would have been significantly greater. It was only because I included Global, which was actually fairly neutral, and then CTV, which was balanced almost, that it wasn't completely skewed toward the negative. When other people have looked at the CBC, incidentally, they have found that CBC, the people who work there, are significantly more likely to vote for the NDP than average Canadians. Significantly. Lydia Miljan is the woman who studied this. She wrote, I can't remember the name of her book, but she was nominated for the Donner Prize, which is for social scientific writing. And she did an extensive survey and found that the CBC actually tends not to hire people who don't have similar political and social views to them. And that's frightening. Another fellow who's also looked at that in terms of the academy is Jonathan Haidt out of the United States. He's shown that in the university, it's really difficult to get hired if you have a conservative point of view nowadays. Back to your idea, what can be done about it? Maybe we can start talking about diversity of opinion and not just diversity of people in terms of skin or culture. We all agree that diversity of culture, diversity of skin color, diversity of ethnicity is a good thing. But what about diversity of ideas? That seems to be something that no one is willing, or very few people on the left are willing to talk about. And it's only when you have a diversity of ideas that you actually can find the truth somewhere in between. The way that I like to look at it is, my original degree was in philosophy, and as a philosophy student I had to read John Stuart Mill, and he wrote a book called On Liberty. And on liberty, he says, listen, the reason that you need to be able to express all the ideas, even the ideas of people you don't like, is because they may be right and you may have been wrong. And you can't know because you can't see the future. And if you can't see the future, you've got to let everybody say everything and just kind of let it work itself out. Because we do have cases where a particular idea wasn't allowed to be spoken, and the person and that side of it was wrong. The side that was the dominant side was wrong. So it's only when you let a free exchange of ideas that you eventually can find the truth, because it bubbles to the surface. At the very back.
Could you comment on what impact the increase in using online sources for your news has had on objectivity?
How online sources affected objectivity, given that online sources tend not to be credible or might not be credible? Is that what you're thinking?
Or just in general, as people shift more towards online sources?
Well, I think that online sources tend to be news aggregators as opposed to news producers. And by that I mean, when you look at something like BuzzFeed, BuzzFeed often is commenting on something that a mainstream outlet has already put out. Huffington Post is often commenting on something that was put out. It's a news aggregator. They don't often have their own coverage in so much as they like to comment. So in that way, it really does promote less objectivity because there's a certain ideological slant that they're trying to promote. They're going to choose the parts of that story that fit their ideology best. So it's probably a decrease in objectivity that happens in these news aggregators.
Anybody else?
One other comment. So in the this post-Trump election, there's been talk of that we're living in I believe it was post-truth society. Can you kind of contextualize that? Like what's happening with that?
Well, I think it's an opportunity for Christians. It's an opportunity for Christians to take a stand and say, there is truth. And ultimately, people are going to find out that without truth, society crumbles. But with truth, society thrives. And in terms of the truth of Christianity, I think that Christians need to realize how far Christianity has brought the world and the truth of Christianity and what it's done for the world. They need to use a phrase from the left, they need to educate themselves. And part of that is just knowing your history, maybe knowing some of your sociology. For instance, I've got 4 kids, and I tell my own kids, because they often hear in their school system that really all ideas are relative. There's no one idea that's better than another. And in terms of Christianity, it probably has done more harm than good. But historically, that's just not true. It's just not accurate. I would say that in this post-truth culture and society, it's more incumbent upon Christians to know their history, to know their social scientific facts about their own faith, and then to use that as evidence that this is truth. Yes, yes.
I just, maybe this is nitpicking, but there was a slide and you were talking about over 50% of the reports you analyzed were biased, I think you said?
Yeah, had biased content, yes.
And I think you listed through a few of those biases, and the percentages, I believe it was kind of total to 46%.
Yeah.
Were there other?
There were others. So the ones that I didn't include were less than 8%, but they included unintelligent, criminally minded. No, I did criminally minded. So unintelligent. There were a few other categories that I actually can't remember off the top of my head, but they would equal about 50. But that was. I'm glad somebody caught that. I think I put largest responses as just to. All right. Well, thanks everybody. I appreciate that.
Yeah, on the behalf of the McMaster University, we'd like to thank you for coming out tonight. And if at all during the event you thought, oh, I recognize this face, yes, he was in a rock band, and yes, it was called Myth of Innocence. So if you want any autographs or pictures afterwards, you could line up for those. So make sure to bring your survey cards, fill it all out, and bring them over to the ushers as well as your pencils. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and enjoy your evening.